Let's get started. I'm Kirk Nordstrom. I'm co-chair with Carol Green of the Mackenzie Lecture Committee. And Carol is here. If she would just stand up and say hi, please. Thanks. The committee's been really great in getting this year's lecture and going and all the arrangements that have to be made. I really appreciate that. I'd like to welcome you all to First Congregational Church, and this is the first of several events this week with our guest speaker, Dr. Jenny Price. Our church sponsors the Mackenzie Lectureship, which was named for Reverend Bruce Mackenzie, who was senior pastor here for 27 years. And I'm really pleased that Bruce's daughter, Ellen, could be here today. And I had asked her to just introduce herself and say a few words.
Hi. As you said, the lectureship is named after my father and mother. My dad was the pastor here for 27 years. He retired in 1997. And the Mackenzie Lectureship was one of the many wonderful gifts bestowed on my mother and dad on his retirement. Since then, the lectureship has presented annual speakers that have broadened our knowledge and vision and hopefully left us thoughtful and empowered. This year is no exception. I read the book, Stop Saving the Planet, pushing us out of our comfort zone. One thing I got out of her book is don't buy new, reuse. My parents was purchased when we lived in California around 1957. Dad reupholstered it when we lived in Denver and still had it when we sold the Boulder house in 2012. The mattress they bought when they got married was also still being used in the house. I'm so pleased that the congregation thought to bestow this gift as a legacy to my parents, and I thank you for continuing the mission of the lectureship. I look forward to it every year.
Now, the normal venue for the Mackenzie Lecture is for our speaker to give a presentation followed by a Q&A. This time, we're doing something a little different, who will speak in dialogue with Dr. Patty Limerick about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' book, To Heal a Fractured World. Yeah, that was bad.
Humor. I'm free. Pro bono.
I'll get to you. Right. So I'd like to give a few words of introduction. One could say that, far be it for me to say it, but we have a dialogue tonight between two very creative troublemakers. I refer to the kind of trouble that reaps benefits. They look for ways to wake us up from our contentment or self-satisfaction and challenge us to rethink what we're doing. Patty Limerick, in addition to being a member of our church, is well known not only at the University of Colorado, where she's a history professor, and to readers of the Denver Post, the New York Times, but also widely known as faculty director of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado, and many notable publications, from essays such as interesting ones that I discovered, Dancing with Professors, the trouble with academic prose is the subtitle. To books such as What Every Westerner Should Know About Energy Efficiency and Conservation, to films like The Lover's Guide to the West. And very deservedly, in 2001, she won the CU's highest award for teaching and research, the Hazel Barnes Award. I got to meet her during a series of excellent presentations about the pros and cons of fracking that she arranged at CU with Joe Ryan from Environmental Engineering. This was about every month they would have a speaker come and I literally mean every aspect of fracking that you can imagine. They covered it. Now, it took them doing once a month, took them about a year and a half to get there, but they did. It was fabulous. And Patty was an amazing moderator. I've never seen anybody do such a good job at moderating. Jenny Price is armed with a PhD in history, also from Yale University, and uses her skills as a writer and artist to challenge us about how we think about the environment, the economy, public space, guns, and LA. Wait a minute, LA? Now, wait a minute. I'm from California, okay, as Patty is too. And I told Jenny what I thought about LA in 2 words, Cadillac Desert. But she has a different take, having spent a lot more time in that other part of the state. I'm from San Francisco Bay Area. So, you know, we always talk about Southern California is a different state, and Southern California is talking about Northern California is a different state. But she spent a lot more time there than I have. A bit of approach to how we think about present predicaments, as well as her video series entitled, What Are You Doing? Stop Saving the Planet. Her art projects include deprivatizing public spaces, and after spending, 15 years in LA, something like that, 2016 she has been a research fellow at the Sam Fox School of Design Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. That's enough time for me to take up, and it gives you a quick introduction. I'd now like to turn it over to the troublemakers.
We'll come through on that. I think that we have such a debt to that, for that phrase, good trouble, from the recently departed congressman, so I think we are good troublemakers. She's probably a little bit ahead of me in the trouble scene there.
think so.
She is an applied historian. That's what my great passion is at Southern American West, of people with degrees in history who say, well, okay, now how can we make a difference with that? So I've been a great fan and admirer. She does things of extraordinary humor and creativity. And tomorrow at 11 o'clock, if you're free, come to the Mackey Gallery, Mackey Auditorium Gallery, where, can I give a little bit of a hint of what you're going to be?
Oh, yeah, sure.
All righty. She will be appearing as Mother Nature in her own mother's white nightgown. So, and then we will also have 2 wonderful professors, Beth Osnes and Michelle Ellsworth, who are going to be, Beth will be in chrysalis for the first part, and then will come out as a butterfly, so that will be something you won't want to miss. And Michelle will be a couple of different Greek tragic heroines, Clytemnestra, a couple of those. And I will be the university fool, so we have all the bases covered for that.
And I'll be the super fun administrator of Region
She will be
7
from that EPA, which is the Environment and People
agency.
That's different from the other one we know, and she will be in charge of Superfund. You'll notice that did not have a D. So, okay. Okay, so I rest my case. And our program, we're trying to push the envelope that's called The Surprising Force of Unconventional Communication and Reckoning with Climate Change, demonstrated in extremely real time. So Mackey Auditorium at 11, if you want to see. It will be a little bit wild tonight, but we're going to be wilder tomorrow. And then there's a 5:30 program as well, and there are flyers out there. So we are here tonight with a person who seems very present to us, but who has passed away in 2020, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was the lead rabbi, really, in the United Kingdom for a number of years and wrote many wise books. I want to thank my friend Michael Polikoff, who brought this book to my attention initially. And you cannot look at its title, To Heal a Fractured World, The Ethics of Responsibility, without thinking, well, that could be helpful with climate change. That's something we could ponder. The striking fact is that this is a book about a fractured world, and it is not particularly about there's nothing really about climate change in it. So here's what I would swear on a Bible. The old part and the newer part, both parts of the Bible, because we're quite into the Hebrew Bible in this book. I would swear that this book, written in 2005 with no mention of climate change, is enormously useful for people who are trying to figure out how can we energize the response of human beings to climate change in a productive and positive way. So reading this book, and many other problems as well, I think it just brings an extraordinary spirit and insight. So I ended up thinking to myself, this is what I have wanted someone to tell me in 2022. And I didn't even know. That's the whole reason why I needed someone to tell me. But reading the book, I thought, that's what I wanted. And we're here on a, well, actually, maybe we should just hear, do you want to just say right now what your reading experience was?
Sure. So first, I just want to thank everyone. I've never spoken in a church before, and this is a real privilege, and everybody's been so welcoming and generous. Even before I got here, I just want to thank Chris and the whole Mackenzie committee, and it's always an adventure. You can never say no to doing something with Patty, so this is a real privilege. But so Patty told me about this, and then she said, and I think on the first night, instead of doing a talk, as Kirk said, we'll have a conversation about this book, about Jewish ethics. And I thought, oh my God, what has Patty gotten me into? Jewish ethics. I don't know anything about Jewish ethics, right? But it turns out, once I read the book, I was actually very, very moved by it. And it turns out my book is a book of Jewish ethics, which I didn't really know. I have a lot of biblical backup, actually, that I didn't really know about. And because I think that I don't actually consider myself to be a very religious Jewish person, culturally very Jewish, but I consider myself to have been a person who was raised with a strong sense of ethics and who's tried to, do work that does some good in the world and that sort of thing, and to be an ethical person. And I was raised with parents who really cared about justice and equal rights, and my dad represented people during the McCarthy era, and my mom founded the Fair Housing Movement. So, and I always thought of that as sort of political values that were passed on to me. And what I realized when I read Jonathan Sachs's book is that my parents were themselves sort of, acting on this foundation probably of Jewish ethics that they had probably, inherited. And I never really, in my old age now, I'd never really thought about it that way all these years. And so it was actually really moving. I'm really glad that you asked me to read the book, because I probably would not have read it otherwise. So, it sort of, it gave me some insight into myself, I think.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think Jonathan Sachs would be really pleased to know that we are doing this, even if he would have moments where he'd think, that's not really what I was thinking about, or that's not the place I was expecting to apply it. But well, you'll see. We are just going to give you that as a teaser. I was planning, this will terrify Jenny, because I said, I had this really good idea for how I was going to start. It was going to be like one of those, a rabbi, a priest, and a swami walk into a bar thing. But it wasn't going very well, because it was going to be a person who sees herself as a cultural Jew, but not terribly religious Jew, a not Jew, and a very prominent British rabbi who has passed away walk into a congregational church.
Yeah.
Well, they're laughing.
Yeah.
When I tried that this afternoon, it didn't seem to go so well. But
Yeah, and can I just say that I think the whole book is really about applying this kind of, body of ethics that's been accumulated over the years to today's world and to the issues that we face. So I think actually he would be thrilled.
I think you would.
He's probably dancing right now.
Yeah, and I have had my moments of thinking, oh, dear me, am I heading off the edge here into cultural appropriation, and am I lifting other people's religious traditions? But he is pretty explicit about saying, well, this is the interesting thing. I think he's very explicit about saying he is writing to people of faith, and they might be Jewish, they might be Christian, they might be Muslim. I don't know if he knew he was writing for people without faith. It seems... I guess I was glad that I joined this church in August of 2020, because I thought I made the audience list here for Rabbi Sachs. But I think it is we'll have a little discussion of how much I think his plea for human beings to take responsibility and take action, I think it really is based on an assumption of faith. But does that actually then exclude others? Well, we're going to disagree a little bit on that maybe when we come to that. So I'm going to begin by reading one of his opening statements about what he was doing with this book. I have written this book not only for Jews, but also as a Jewish voice in the conversation of humankind, for we all wrestle with questions of the meaning of our lives and the kind of world we will leave to those who come after us. At such times, we need not only the passions of the present, but the wisdom of our several traditions, lovingly handed on from generation to generation, the gift of the past to the future, and the offering each heritage can make to the moral imagination of humankind. So that is ecumenical and extraordinary when you know, as I'm about to tell you, this is drawing on the rabbinical tradition over 1,500 years, 2,000 years, or
All the Second Temple.
Yeah, since the fall of the Second Temple. So the pulling together of different things, it's just such a gift from this man to say, I will read all this stuff and know it very thoroughly, and then I'll give you the best parts. I think. How do I know? How would I know the best parts? Well, anyway, it seems to me he did a great service for that. And I'm going to add just another item from his goals. The real question is, what does it take to make people moral, given all the distractions, temptations, and alternatives that our complex nature constantly throws in our path? So that's what we're after. And we are going to begin with just a reminder of our topic. Our title is Repairing the Earth, Embracing Freedom Through Responsibility. And he totally stepped up to the plate to help us with that concept. So we're going to begin with, where in lots of ways, it's just the fundamental part of this book, that Tikkun Olam?
Tikkun Olam. See,
Okay.
I know a few things.
Yeah, okay. So, and I don't. So it's Tikkun Olam.
Which means mending the world. It's a sort of a Jewish principle.
And it is an idea that, well, I'll just read. I just feel like I have to share some of his words, and paraphrasing this man is not something I am capable of doing. So I just will read this. Mending and perfecting the world is an expression of the faith that it is no accident that we are here in this time and place with these gifts and capacities and this opportunity to make a positive difference in the world. We are here because someone wanted us to be, and because there is a task only we can fulfill. No two people, places, times, and circumstances are the same, where what can I do meets what needs to be done. There is God's challenge and our task. And the fact that my voice is breaking as I read that says a little bit about the religiousness of that passage and why it is striking me so hard here. So if that doesn't have a direct tie to climate change, I don't know what does.
Yeah, so I'm just going to weigh in, I
Please,
think.
please.
So we picked out passages that really leapt out at us, and what was interesting is that Patty picked out that whole passage, and I picked out just the last sentence. I'm going to actually be sort of the practical one here tonight, I think, which is probably my favorite sentence in the book, which is where what can I do meets what needs to be done. There is God's challenge and our task. And I love that because, as those of you who have read my troublemaking book know, I really go after this environmentalist focus on individual action. And I think that I'm not against individual action. I hope you all got that who read the book. But I do think that so much of environmentalism has been so much more about what can I do than what needs to be done. And that it's important to me to emphasize that, trying to beat back climate change isn't about being a virtuous person. That's actually not the goal for me. I think actually we disagree on this a little bit, but for me, the goal when you're trying to do something about climate change is not, the ultimate goal is not to be a virtuous person, it's actually to do something about climate change. And I feel like what's happened in environmentalism, and this goes back since I was a kid to the first Earth Day in 1970, is that so much of what we do is more about being a virtuous person and really can't do much about climate change. And so I really like this emphasis on where what can I do meets what needs to be done. There is God's challenge. I think that, to me, that's just really, really powerful.
And I know we're in the zone of our topic of the relationship between the individual and the community and the individual enterprises and the larger community enterprise, but I think I want to introduce that with our difference of opinion on the phrase small steps.
Okay.
I think we have a difference of opinion there. So
Yeah.
I love this part. I have no idea what the Lurianic Kabbalah is. So we'll just start off by referring to it with the understanding that I don't know what I'm talking about, but I do know that it's a beautiful quotation. The significance of Lurianic Kabbalah?
Kabbalah.
Okay. Kabbalah is that it is this is in italics in his, Rabbi Sachs is saying, a redemption of small steps, act by act, day by day. Each act mends a fracture of the world. I like that so much because you do not need to get paralyzed by, is this really going to change the whole world? Am I making the biggest difference? You're just this a redemption of small steps. I just am enchanted by that phrase. The way from here to there, like the journey of the Israelites through the wilderness, takes time. There are setbacks on the way, sins, rebellions, false turns. A journey of a few days takes 40 years. But there are no shortcuts, no miraculous leaps. So that phrase, a redemption of small steps, I read it to the waitress in a restaurant 3 days ago who is teaching in a GED program for people who didn't get high school degrees. She heard that. She said she was just so happy with that phrase. So I am fine with that. Is it sufficient for the big challenges of climate change? And this is where I shall probably be conceding some ground here.
Yeah, so we were talking about this afternoon, and Patty read me this, and, again, tears. Yeah, you're like my brother, actually. My brother, is moved to tears very, very easily, which I actually find to be a wonderful trait.
Me too,
and,
I find that.
He's actually the modern Orthodox Jew. I've learned a lot from him. And I was just sort of sitting there sullenly, and finally I said, well, Patty, so much of what I talk about is how small steps aren't getting us anywhere. Like, there's been this sort of really bad math among environmentalists that all these small actions will add up, and for 53 years, 52 years, they haven't added up. They don't add up. They're not going to add up. And what we really need is big steps. Like, we're out of time. We need big steps. So then we started talking, and we thought, well, okay, we're not that far apart, actually, because what it means is that what small steps do you take? And, again, this comes back, like, what is your goal? If you're just, I don't know, driving a Tesla or recycling, which is basically probably not even going to get recycled, probably not. But if maybe the small steps that you're taking towards collective change and social change, and this is sort of another piece of the book that I found moving, that I do have a brother who's modern Orthodox, and so I've learned a lot through him about what it means to be religious as a Jew. And I was really moved when Rabbi Sachs talks about, he says, Judaism is a collective faith. Its central experiences are not private but communal. And I thought, well, that has a lot of valence for thinking about, climate change and thinking about the role of individual action. Like, you can't even pray unless you have 10 people in the room. You cannot say the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, for a loved one unless you have 10 people in the room, because that person, I'm probably bungling this, but that person was part of your society. So I think I found that moving, because I've seen the ways in which, because I think there's a sort of fundamental principle there that can sort of guide us towards collectivity. We have to talk about Reuben at some point, too.
We'll get, Reuben, let's put Reuben down. That's Jacob's brother, in case you're wondering who we're talking about here. But Joseph.
Jacob's eldest son
and Joseph's brother,
Has everybody seen the musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolors? Reuben's the
Is
eldest.
there anything in there about brightly colored clothes?
Yes. Be careful.
I know. Where is that pit into which I might be thrown?
On the other hand, you could end up running,
right.
Egypt.
Okay, so we're getting, we do know, I had got Jacob and Joseph confused, but I came out of that fast. So I want to say one thing about that, though, is that I still think there is something so liberating, freedom and responsibility for human beings if you say, a little step, that'd be worth something. And what I had hoped for tonight, it didn't quite work out. 3 weeks ago on the street, I ran into a former student from the 1990s who was getting into a service truck, and he is a repairman, an appliance repairman. And Jenny's book says that's the thing. The most environmentally sensible appliance you have is the one that you already have that you repair, and you spare the world, the creation of the new one. So my dream, didn't work out, was to have my former student, he was not available, to have John sitting in the room, and then I could say, there's an environmental hero in the room today, but he wasn't able to join us. But it is great to think of the appliance repairmen and repairwomen as it's small steps, but it's really thought out and careful steps. Repair that appliance. Mm-hmm. Don't create a new one with all the damage of that. So the nature of the step is as important as the size. And
I agree. Yeah.
So you were onto the individual and community.
Reuben. Yeah.
Reuben. Yeah.
So Reuben, one of the reasons I really recommend this book is I thought I would just be slogging through philosophy, which I don't have a lot of patience with. But it's actually it's actually full of stories and full of really interesting interpretations of the Old Testament stories. And one of them is about Reuben, the eldest son of Jacob. And everybody knows about Jacob, right, and the multicolored coat. I'm sure you all know the Old Testament far better than I do. And
You should make your honest confession that you made, that you knew you would be the person in, well, say what you were going to say about yourself, as the person in the room who knew the least
who knows the least about the Bible? Yeah, probably.
that's right.
That's probably true. Yeah.
And I was going to be right behind her, except that I actually do know quite a bit more than you do on it. So, okay, so that was just a little moment. We were in graduate school.
I know
For
a
heaven's
little
sake,
bit.
We get competitive from time to time as to which of us knows the least about the Bible.
That's
We're
right.
competing about that now. So go ahead.
I probably know less history. I'm sure I know less history. Where was I? So Reuben, yes, he has this great story about like how Reuben can't get anything right. Right? He's very well intentioned, but he can't get anything right. And so the major way in which he doesn't get anything right is Joseph, the youngest brother, gets thrown into the pit to perish by all of the other brothers, and Reuben intends to go back and rescue him, but he doesn't get there. By the time he gets there, he's already been pulled out by the
traders.
the traders. Or I forget. So, and he goes through all these other things. I mean, poor Reuben. He keeps trying to do the right thing, and he just doesn't get anything right. And so, for me, I really love that because it's an example of sort of good intentions are great, but if they don't matter, it's like ultimately, again, it's not about being well-intentioned. It's about actually making an impact. And again, I think environmentalism has been full of good intentions and also really bad intentions. I say there's an environmentalism of good intentions and environmentalism of bad intentions. It sort of preys on the environmentalism of good intentions, but I won't get into that just now. Yeah.
Okay. So we're on to freedom and responsibility, or?
Have we done,
Right.
Sure.
We actually have quite a carefully worked out plan here, as you'll notice, and we even have the same plan, so that's even.
Well, we'll see.
Right. Speaking of individual and community.
We may or may not have the same plan. Okay.
We'll find that out.
Yeah.
We won't when we get to faith,
we do.
probably. But so this is a passage, and again, the subtitle of this book is "The Ethics of Responsibility," and Rabbi Sachs at one point makes this statement: the Hebrew Bible is an extended essay on human responsibility. So we picked the right theme for our title for our talk, and this where he brings freedom together. I'll just read that passage because it is so well aimed. With freedom is born responsibility. If we are not free, if what we do is the result of natural laws, inexorable forces beyond our control, if we are not free, then we are not responsible. Freedom, choice, moral agency, accountability, merit, guilt, retributive justice, atonement, and forgiveness are interlocking concepts that were born together, and they have their genesis in the Hebrew Bible. And there is the ethics of responsibility with its emphasis on the love of God and humanity and on the categorical dignity of the individual as such, regardless of status and power. So he is so explicit that responsibility and the recognition of that responsibility is actually the basis of great joy, possibly, in life. As he says in another passage, referring to all the people he's been writing about in this book, all the stories he's telling about people, what united the people whose stories he chose to tell, he says, is their opposition to learned helplessness. Then he says, this is one of the best lines in the book, responsibility is the negation of learned helplessness. Responsibility is a great weight to carry, but the alternative, the learned helplessness, the alternative is heavier still. So I don't know how there's any way of reversing that conditioning, but to say, well, you'll have to take responsibility, sort of, the burden has come upon me, but you'll have to take responsibility, and then you will be free. That's, I think he has that nailed, and yet it's so counterintuitive to a societal sense that when we have to take the responsibility, it's time for a sigh. So, but responsibility is the ticket to being fully exhilarated with
Human.
what you can be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just fill that in a little bit because this is one of the places where I thought the stories that he told were so fascinating. So the way he talks about sort of the Bible as a call to responsibilities, he says the Bible begins with 4 stories. And they all say something a little bit different about responsibility, and you move through them. It's very intentional. You move through them, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the first is Adam and Eve, who take no responsibility for what they do. And then the next one is Cain and Abel, where Cain admits what he does, but he takes no moral responsibility. Boy, I sound like a biblical scholar now, don't I? And then there's Noah and the flood, where Noah builds the ark but takes no collective responsibility. He doesn't warn anyone, he doesn't, right? So there's no real social responsibility. And then he talks about the Tower of Babel, where there's no, what he calls ontological responsibility. There's no responsibility to acknowledging God, essentially, is what Rabbi Sachs is talking about. But I think, to me, again, it's very translatable for thinking about climate change and responsibility. You know, do we take no responsibility or no moral responsibility or no social responsibility, which is a lot of what I talk about, and then a lot of other people actually who work on climate change talk about ontological responsibility, which could either be, I think, interpreted here either as responsibility to a larger force or a responsibility to the rest of creation, right? You know, which is also going down the tubes with us. So it could be, you know, responsibility to the natural world also. So I love, that was one of the places where I just love the ways that he interprets the stories in the Bible to talk about this call to responsibility.
And in our time, if we could start a quiet little experimental movement where if someone says, "Did you have a good day?" you can say, "I really had a good day. It was filled with responsibility." And enough of that going on, and people would say, "Are you okay? I mean, how did you get to that? What if you say, oh, I can't tell you, I got up in the morning and there was all this responsibility, and then, oh, by the middle of the day, it was just, oh my goodness, it was just an ocean of responsibility." It's just great. Eventually, enough people going around and saying that could start a different perception in the Saxian mode of saying, lucky us to have that, because as he said, responsibility, that's freedom.
Actually, Pat, can I read a quote
Yes,
that we didn't
please.
talk about, but it occurs to me that
yeah.
I think it flows
Yes.
right from there,
Yeah.
where he talks about, he's a little bit anti-postmodern, which I'm not so cool on. You know, I mean, he begins with a critique of Karl Marx, which I think is probably uncalled for and probably too simplified. But anyway, he says, ethics has tended to turn inward, becoming a matter of personal choice rather than collective responsibility, which I love. And then he says that inward turn in Western societies takes radically different forms, from consumerism to spirituality and the exploration of the self, so a particular kind of spirituality, to aggressively anti-modern forms of religious practice and belief. These phenomena have one thing in common. They are an attempt to create a safe space. Remember, he wrote this in 2005. A shelter from the world outside, a haven in a heartless world. And to me, that's a really interesting sort of like, what he's saying, I think, instead of taking responsibility, people just find it so overwhelming that they find solace and refuge and retreat. You know, all of which can be helpful even for thinking about collective responsibility, but again, if that's the end of it, it's not so helpful for thinking about climate change. You know, just say, because now there's a big emphasis on climate grief, right?
Yes.
And climate anxiety, and people are seeing therapists about their climate anxiety, and I mean, anyone under 30 should probably be seeing a therapist about their climate anxiety, but also feel like, okay, but that you need to mobilize that grief and anxiety, probably.
Right, and that's what by the time we're at the end of this really is I'm not saying that you come out of this process of reflection that we've been on thinking, well, the world isn't in as bad a shape as we thought. You don't come out with that, but you come out of it with as if there's a section in this book where he talks about the sense of responsibility, collective responsibility for all humanity. And he says, and he doesn't over-dramatize this, he just says, the Jews had a very strong sense that they were responsible for each other's protection and well-being. He said, but for 1,800 years, they didn't have any sense of responsibility for humanity. They couldn't vote, they couldn't in civic ways. Why would they go around thinking that they were going to exercise responsibility for others when they had such extremely, well, they didn't have powers to do that. So that was a moment in there where I won't even say the other forms of tragedy and limitation that are there, but to have a person coming out of a historical tradition of 1,800 years of not being able to do anything without extreme restrictions and so on, and to have this person write a book that is so we'll take it on. That I just am swept away by that. And anyone who wants to be deeply into a sense of personal grief over the fact that the world is not working well, perfectly understandable, but really, after you put this down, you think, well, let's take it on. So, and in that spirit, the everyday practice issue.
Oh, yes. You want me to talk about that? Mm-hmm. So, one of the other things I love in this book is talking about everyday practice, which I have seen. So I'll just actually, this is what he says. Judaism is a religion of study and ethical reflection, but also intensively about practice, about what we eat, how we conduct every aspect of our lives, and how we structure our time. The life of the commands is an ongoing exercise in character formation, a sustained seminar in Judaism's habits of the heart. We become ethical not just by what we know, but also by what we do. And this is something that, and again, I should say, in general, Rabbi Sachs emphasizes that it's not that Jews have some kind of monopoly on any of these ideas, that these same ideas and these ethics come from a lot of different directions, but this is a particular tradition that has, something to offer the wider world. And this is something I've learned a lot about from my brother when he became modern Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox. There's a big difference, sort of. He was doing all this stuff. I mean, like, you can't mix meat and milk? I mean, why? That seems ridiculous in the 21st century. It was actually the 20th century when he first started doing it. Or Shabbat, the kids couldn't go bike riding, or, you couldn't do all kinds of things. And it seemed like a lot of restrictions. And finally I asked him, like, well, explain this to me. This is strange to me. And he said, well, almost all the rituals are about three things. They're about paying attention to food, time, and sex. And it suddenly kind of made, I understood. That was a turning point for me. I kind of understood. And I think for me, I've thought a lot about this with ethics outside religion and with environmental ethics, that because there's been this long, there's been this very, very long tradition in environmentalism of we have to change people's consciousness. Right? Ever since the 60s, for those of you who are in the 60s, as I was, we have to change people's consciousness. That's what we have to do. And I always thought, what, are you going to sit 350 million people down and change? It never really made sense to me. And I think, no, the way that the question that you started with is, how do you make people moral? Children grow up in a moral society. And how do you do that? You have, I think, ritual and practice, are really important. You become a moral person, I think, by what you do, more than by what you say, right, or what you think. And I really strongly believe that, because people always ask me, well, how do we get all those people who don't believe in climate change, or all those people who voted for whoever, to change their minds? And I'm like, you make their lives better. You don't talk to them one by one, all 350 million Americans. You make their lives better. And then it becomes an everyday, like through everyday practice. So I really feel strongly like, we need to live in a society where you act in environmentally sustainable ways. It's just baked in, right? It's not like this virtue. It's just baked in because you live in a virtuous society, and that involves practice. He also says I love this. He says, the festivals, by reenacting the great events of the past, turn history into memory. And memory is one of the great guardians of conscience. And I'll just end, because I know I've been talking a bit, but where this really came home to me is when I had a brother who died, and about 20 years ago, and my brother Joe, who's religious, he was the only one of us who knew what to do, because he had this accumulated wisdom rituals and the Jewish rituals of mourning. And I don't love all the Jewish rituals, but the Jewish mourning rituals, I think, have an enormous amount of accumulated wisdom about just human nature when something tragic happens, and the timeline that you need, and the people that you need or don't need, and he was the only one who really knew what to do, and that's when I really really thought a lot about sort of everyday practice and the importance of, what ritual can do for you, as someone who had always been, no, I don't want ritual, I don't want tradition, none of that. So.
Yeah, and this, in fact, bridges, we only have 2 or 3 more topics left here, but to our next topic of stories and why he uses stories as his. It's pretty rare for him to go into more than a sentence or two of, this is what I'm talking about, this is what I mean. It's always interwoven in stories. And then this is just a direct tie with what you said. He's explaining why, and it is the accumulated wisdom, because it is hundreds and hundreds of years of stories that he's drawing on. But also stories about people he knew and stories that that people told him. Anyway, I have told these stories because in the end, stories are where theology comes off the page and begins to transform the landscape of humanity. The faith that counts is the faith made real in lives and deeds and words that heal some of the wounds of a fractured world. So, the story thing.
I always say, like, if you think that you can tackle climate change only with technology and science, only with the STEM fields, and that you do not need the superpowers of the arts or the superpowers of the humanities, you're in a fantasy land. You're in a fantasy world, right? We have this kind of, I think, in our society. I love STEM, Kirk. I love STEM. But, my mother's a neuroscientist, but we have a fetishization, I think, of STEM, and of STEM, of science, and quantification is the only true way of knowing, and I think that's very, very dangerous. And one thing he talks about, he actually says, there is a Jewish saying, God created mankind because he loves stories. And the Bible itself is one of the key examples of truth as story, as opposed to the more usual Western model of truth as system. And I just think people think in stories. And, for me, telling new stories about our relationships to environment, about how our economy works, about the connections between them, is so much more important than developing carbon capture technology or figuring out electric cars, because I just don't think that those are the solutions. I actually think that the solutions are in ethics, and that we need storytelling. And I know you're a huge fan of storytelling, Patty, so I don't want to monopolize
Chris Broadway
this.
Bauman knows a little bit about this too, and Linda Akovich as well. So, right, and yet for some reason, it doesn't seem to figure so much in public communications from knowledgeable people about climate change. I'm not a fan of Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth. The reason why I'm not is because I've given lots of public speeches, and when Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth is traveling to make him look like a solitary hero, he is never met at the airport. And through that film, I'm just thinking, I'm not a vice president. I'm met at the airport when I go to give a speech, but he's always pulling his suitcase along, solitary. Even when he's going to go up to the lectern, there's nobody there, and I just thought. And then when the drama is a PowerPoint with a hockey stick, and it's sort of, is that what we're going to do for stories? Now, there are plenty of stories, Lord, about Alaskan Native people losing their villages and plenty of stories, but it seems it's underutilized in climate change communication education. Now, this is the one, a particular dimension of many of Rabbi Sachs' stories. It's humor. And he tells the story of a very heroic man, a Jewish pediatrician who just saved so many young folks and was extraordinary. And what he says of that man was that he took, this pediatrician was so serious about God, and he thought God was so serious that he himself, the pediatrician, did not need to take himself seriously. So, Yay.
Yeah.
And so I'm now going to read some perfectly beautiful statements that Rabbi Sachs makes about humor. The sociologist Peter Berger, he says, calls humor a signal of transcendence. A joke, Peter Berger said, is a vignette of salvation. Humor, and more quotations there. Well, these are things that actually American Indian people have said as well. Humor is at its most intense among persecuted people. It is the weapon of the weak against the strong. What we can laugh at momentarily, we do not fear. Humor is the oldest form of cognitive therapy. Jewish humor in particular lives in its ability at the last moment to get us to see things differently, to reframe. The joke seems to be going one direction, whoop, it takes a turn. Humor gives us a way out from what, until the last line, is that impossible situation, and then it turns it into something we can laugh at. What we can laugh at, we can rise above. Humor is the assertion of humanity in the face of dehumanizing influences. Humor is a way of breaking the grip of fears that would otherwise hold us captive. It is, in its way, one of the supremest expressions of human freedom. Freedom as the ability to redefine our situation. Those who can laugh at fate redeem it from tragedy. One who rejects his enemy's interpretation of events cannot be made a victim. Psychologically, he or she remains free. Humor is first cousin to hope. A joke testifies to our ability to see things differently, and because we can do so, we are free. Now, I have always had an incorrigible, intractable, she's seen it for a long time, and just try to control it, Patty. No, I cannot. So the humor thing has always been, it's irrepressible. I can't do anything about it. But to read that description, I thought, method to my madness here, method to my madness. Look at that. And I know that this actually is one reason, I've not had a very hard life really at all, but it just seems like each of those lines, we cannot be made a victim if we're finding the person who's going to victimize us funny. So what a great piece. And as you might tell from that, there's a lot of funny lines in this book. But what a liberation, and what a direct tying of humor to freedom. The surrender of freedom to surrender of responsibility, surrender of power, surrender of... So shall I read it again? No, just kidding. But boy, do I love those passages.
Yeah.
And how is humor faring in climate communications?
Not very well. I loved how you moved directly from Al Gore to humor. That was a good move.
That's not easily done.
He did a lot of good things, but when he gives you this film that's just this like terrifying look at the collapse of the ice shelves, and then there's a lot of people say this, and then he says, change your light bulbs. And you're like,
yeah.
What? Okay, so humor. I too am incorrigible. My dad used to call me a smartass, but I got it from him. So I'm the youngest. I have 3 older brothers, so humor is my weapon, but they're all really funny too. So I've always tried to use humor. And I think that it's dangerous. The notorious humorlessness of environmentalism, it's notorious, it's easy to make fun of. Like South Park has this episode called Smog Alert, where there's this cloud of smog advancing on the Bay Area, threatening to engulf it, or I don't know, I could give you a lot of examples that I love. It's really easy to mock this lack of irony and humor, but I think it's dangerous. And I think that's a really interesting take that he had on humor. And he does have this story, remember, about the two, are they rap? No, they're just 2 men in the concentration camp who vow to tell each other 1 joke a day. And it's one of the ways that they actually survive it. But I think that humor is really, really important for bringing down people's defenses. In so many ways that can be really, really helpful. I'm tempted to tell you all kinds of examples, but I think that will take too long. But I think also the reason I see lack of humor and irony in environmentalism, which is really notorious as dangerous, is that not being able to appreciate irony in the 21st century is dangerous. If you want to do something about climate change, you're going to have to appreciate complexity and contradictions, and you're going to have to think anew, and you're going to have to challenge yourself to think about things in completely different ways. And all of that requires an appreciation of irony, I think, and that's to me, one of the superpowers of humor is to get people to think about things differently, which is what he says too.
Exactly.
And it's a lot of humor, you're sort of telling when you're being ironic, you're telling two stories at once. You're telling the old story that you're sort of critiquing, but you're also pointing the way to a new story. And so I think it's actually, let's get real serious about it. It's always annoying when people are so serious about talking about humor, but what was it? There was someone I went to graduate school with, and the title of his dissertation was "The Problem of Humor in American Culture."
Oh, that was Constance Rourke's book.
Oh,
We
no,
all
it was
had to
someone
read
else.
that
It
book, and there was
Paul
not a funny
Farber.
thing in that whole
Yeah,
book.
right.
We were assigned that goofy book, and there was not.
Yeah,
What? That is the most deceptive cover. Constance Rourke's book on American humor.
Yeah.
Don't read it, ladies and gentlemen. It is real. What? Maybe that was a joke. Maybe she was a hilarious person, and she did that as a joke, and got graduate students all over the world having to read that stupid thing. So, thank you for giving me a recovered memory of it.
Sorry.
Shaking nature,
Yeah,
but
PTSD. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a big fan. The only time I have to say it's not intentionally, the only time I've ever not done a project where just the humor just did not come out was when I've written about gun violence. And I don't know why, because I think that, well, I do know why, but you can be humorous about gun violence, but it just doesn't, it doesn't emerge when I write about gun violence. So I guess there are times.
With your humor, though, there's a place where when I guess you just are pulling out the stops there, you're going to make fun in Stop Saving the Planet of tiny little gestures of green virtue, and you say something like getting rid of the bulb that is the less efficient one and putting in the other one or something. But you say that is like sending a passenger pigeon to the fire station instead of calling 911.
A carrier pigeon.
A carrier pigeon.
Let's get our birds right here.
Oh, so
I'm serious about birding, Patty.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Do not get your birds wrong.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that. This one I will get right. And then she has another example of an ineffectual but virtuous kind of thing. And she says that would be like sending a garden snail to the fire station rather than calling 911. And that you said garden snail. I know you did there. So.
Yeah. Can I just speak for a moment about humor in this book? Because this book does something I've never done before. I still don't know whether it was the right thing to do, which is a very fist-shaking book. It's really polemical. It's like not terribly elegant. It's just really like sledgehammer. And because I've just gotten so tired of talking about these ideas and having folks not get what I was saying, so I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to strip it down to the essentials. I'm going to just shake my fist. But I'm going to try to make it funny, right? I'm going to try to, have a lot of humor, and then hopefully people will accept the fist shaking, because nobody wants to read a book that's just fist shaking anger, right? So I don't know. You all can tell me. You would be much better judges of whether that worked or not. But definitely tried to use humor to get people to keep reading. Even though it's a very really fist shaking in a way that I've never tried before, and I'm not sure I'll ever try again. But
we always say at the Southern American West that humor is the WD-40 of conflict and tension. So we are on our last item.
Oh my gosh.
Which is lucky, because I see that we might have
we?
had our last item. Are we okay? We can do one.
Wow, it's
Okay.
gone fast.
So, and really, if you
it's gone fast
tell
for
us
you.
we can't do faith and hope, that's going to be. I just think. I guess she's going to go on a sabbatical, but really, so.
Chris.
So that was a joke. That was what it was. That was humorous. That was a very humorous remark. So we want to end with an absolutely wonderful addition to the 10 Commandments, the "Thou shalt" thing, but don't tell them what it is yet. But we want to go to this little, just a moment or two of my saying, I think this is a great testimony to what constantly examined religious faith can bring out in human beings. And that does not mean that this is an unbroken record of good behavior and the ethics of responsibility, but it is certainly based on faith. And I read one passage here that I think conveys exactly how this matters to Sachs. Long ago, alone at night, Jacob dreamed a dream of a ladder connecting heaven and earth, and of angels ascending and descending. Life is that ladder, for earth cannot be mended without a glimpse of heaven, nor heaven live for humankind without its home on the earth. So that struck me hard and happily. And then this is the way, I think when I tried to read this earlier, I went down for the count and got the voice shaking thing again. But the world is not mended. There is work still to do, and God has empowered us to do it with Him, and for His faith in us. Rabbi Sachs has an extraordinary chapter on God's faith in us. Important whether we have faith in Him or not, that's important, but what's important is that He has faith in us. And as I said, talking to Jenny earlier, somebody's got to have faith in us with the human record that we have. And maybe tiny infants well cared for think, I came into a pretty good population here, but if they hang around for a while, they're going to wonder about that. So that fundament of faith, we hear, if we listen carefully enough, the voice of God asking us, as He asked the first humans, where are you? So I thought, I don't think he's in any way saying secular people should just wallow in the patheticness of their life. He's not saying that. But I did see over and over this affirmation of faith, and I'm going to convert you. No, I'm not going to do that. No, I am not going to do that, and I have no aspiration to that. And that was a joke. That was another joke. The damned humor thing is getting really bad. I'm getting out of control with that. So you are not going to be converted. And I really appreciate, in fact, you're not signing on with my interpretation of that.
You know, I'm realizing that we should have probably switched the order of our comments, because I do have a somewhat more secular, less religious take on faith and hope. And but I think we end up in the same place. I'm actually going to go to the question that Kirk asked me last night as we were driving up the 36, which is like, do you have hope for the future? And I get asked that question almost every time I talk about my work. Do you have hope for the future? And I used to say, do you want the official answer or the unofficial answer? But now I usually say, because it is really the way I feel, what choice do I have? What choice do I have? And I think that is another way. It's a different kind of faith, what choice do I have? That I live in this world. I want to be in this world. I engage this world. I have young people I love with every fiber of my being in this world. I love my family. I love my friends. I love much about this world. I love birds, carrier pigeons. I love ducks. I'm a big bird person. I love the world out there that's not us, and I'm talking about in a way that I tell you not to talk about it in the book. But and so I think we end up in the same place, though.
Yeah,
I say, like, of course I have hope, because otherwise why go on? Yeah.
Right.
Why do all this? I mean, it's not a small thing to write a book. It actually takes a lot of work.
Right. And something that I would call providence, I guess, keeps putting individuals, actions, quotable words in front of us that hope's the only thing to do. And one of those, and good, I just raced by page 123, but thank heavens, working on this together, Jenny, and that's what I want us to end with, because it is really a great addition to the Ten Commandments at the end there. So this is a passage on responsibility for society, and I'll now read a couple of lines from it. We bear responsibility for whatever we could have prevented but did not. We may not be silent in the face of wrongdoing or injustice. We must use whatever influence we have. If we succeed, we have made a difference. If we fail, we have honored our obligation by doing what we could. There is a duty to intervene to prevent wrong when we can, regardless of who commits it and against whom it is committed, sometimes by physical action, at others by argument, reason, and persuasion. Its simplest expression was formulated by Holocaust historian Bauer: "Thou shalt not be a bystander." That's it.
That's it. Thank you.
Well,
That went by fast. Did we really talk for more than 45 minutes? Sure.
Yeah.
So, some questions or comments?
Objections, limericks,
Limericks, right?
anything.
Things we left out. We have more things we could use. If you want more quotations, we have them.
I'm sorry, but would you just give clearly the author and the book that you were basing it on? I didn't really get that at the beginning.
Uh,
Do you want
The
to?
name
sorry,
of the
I
book
supposed
and
to
the
know
author.
You mean the Jonathan Sachs book?
Oh, John.
Yeah.
Yes, Jonathan Sachs, S-A-C-K-S.
S-A-C-K-S.
Yeah.
To Heal a Fractured World.
Yes, that's right. And should you be interested in making sure I spelled that right, there are books out there, and that could be.
Great.
I don't have a question so much as just a comment that I'm an actor, a sometimes actor, and I've taken quite a number of classes on humor, acting humor, down in Denver, and I've been taught that most all humor is based on stepping outside yourself in your situation, in your role, and seeing it within a broader context. And the ridiculousness of the roles we play and the things we do to fulfill those roles. And I think that stepping outside oneself and viewing the system from the outside is essential for responsible climate action, human action, I think.
Right. Humor and humility begin with the same three letters, which surely is not an accident. Although it's not, I don't think, from the Greek or Latin on that. But it does seem, well, I'm working on a couple of projects recently with someone who does not have a sense of humor when it comes to her own activities. And I keep thinking, if only, I'm going to use this story because it was so amusing. I was debating immigration with Governor Dick Lamb, who I liked very, very much. Didn't like his immigration policy so much. So at one point, I should never have done this. Well, okay, so he had a couple of times during this talk where he said something, I'm in a church, but I have to quote it if I'm going to say this right. Okay, no, I'm not going to tell that story because I'd have to use inappropriate language, so I won't. Okay, so I shall instead tell the story about how he said he had brought what was a display of why we could not have any more immigrants coming into the country. This was 25 years or so ago. He had a big container of multicolored gumballs and then a smaller container of multicolored gumballs, and he showed us, this was not, I don't know why he did this, but he showed us that we couldn't absorb any more immigrants into our country by pouring the smaller container into the larger container, which then overflowed. So that was his demonstration. I'm sitting up at a table. I'll stand up soon and respond to some of his remarks. Well, one of the gumballs comes rolling over to me. And I think, don't do that, Patty. And then I think, going to do it. And I'm sad to say each of the gumballs represented, I think, 100,000 people or something. So I should never have done this. But I pick up the one gumball, start chewing on the gumball. The people in the front row see that I am now chewing one of the population overload thing. And so the front row sees it. They start laughing. Governor Lamb is talking, and he doesn't see what has happened here. And it was the funniest thing I've ever seen for the passage of humor. The front row, it's a fairly dense crowd there. The front row laughs. The people in the second row tap them on the shoulder and say, "Why are you laughing? What is she saying?" And they said, "She is chewing on a gumball." And so the second row laughs. The third row taps them on the shoulder and say, "Why are you laughing? She is chewing." So it just ripples through. And Governor Lamb knew something had happened, but he was a very serious person, and he couldn't just say, "Oh, for heaven's sake, why are you all laughing?" And the result of his not doing that. I mean, deadpan humor is funny, I guess. So everybody laughed. There were like 4 cycles that ran through the room because he wasn't just laughing at himself. So I'm working with a person now who has some of that quality where you think, you could just quiet this problem in a second by leading the laughter. And if you can't, Kevin, this is your thing, if you can't step outside for a second and think, well, I'm just giving a serious speech on immigration. Why is everyone, oh, it's that darn fool over there who's got the,
Yeah.
So anyway, it was just, those are many moments where I just think, you could have been the hero in this if you'd been the one leading the laughter, but if you can't do it, you can't make that step outside.
Yeah.
Well,
I think climate activism needs to get a lot more creative and a lot funnier. I think, if you're going to protest outside the Exxon headquarters, have a dance party, right? Have karaoke. There was a wonderful artist collective called Finishing School in LA, and they once had executive order karaoke as an event, and this was during the Bush era, and they had, to the tune of some ABBA song, you actually sang an executive order, that Bush's executive orders. I mean, it was so clever. Just another example, you just need to get a lot more creative instead of just going, hey,
Yeah.
stop it now. We don't want oil, or whatever,
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples is there's some small town in Germany that has this annual, the Nazis march through the town. So instead of setting up a standard counter protest, they turned it into a walkathon so that every step that they took, people donated money towards, organizations that were working for tolerance and were working against the Nazis. And so when the Nazis marched through town, they were raising money for anti-Nazi, and there were people who were cheering them on, and because it was like, yeah, you're raising money for. So we just need to get much, and I think you get a lot more attention when you do that, than when you're just outside chanting. So I've always thought, just start having a ball, and I think, we could actually, make some noise, make a lot more noise by doing that. Am I too close to the microphone?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay.
That walkathon that raised money has been repeated over and over and over again, and it's spread
Oh, really?
throughout different towns.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't
in
know.
Europe. Yeah, and they had a table set up that had, instead of the sign Mein Kampf over it, against the neo-Nazis, it was Mein Mampf, and they had a table full of bananas. Yeah.
What is Mampf? Does that mean?
I think it's the word for banana.
Banana.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Oh, you have a question. Go ahead, David. You ask yours first.
Perhaps this is indulging in willful suspension of your disbelief, but I'll ask the question. Instead of Patty sitting next to you, pretend that it's Mitch McConnell. And you have to convince him, because what you're talking about in part, I believe, is public policy and political action. So Patty is now resuming her other role as Mitch McConnell and can convince that climate denier that we got to do something.
You do not want to hear in this room what I would say to Mitch McConnell if he were sitting next to me.
I think you're being quite disrespectful. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm about to say it. She's triggering me.
She.
No,
What kind
he's
of gender? People in
transgender
gender,
nonsense.
for heaven's sake.
Yeah. It's funny, again, Kirk and I, in our conversation just in the car last night, he said, well, how do you convince, the Koch brothers? And, honestly, my answer is I'm not the least bit interested in talking to Mitch McConnell or convincing him of anything, because he's not convincible. He's not convincible. I mean, this man has grandchildren, right? See? He just left the room. This man, I don't understand, how, I myself don't understand how you can pursue those policies when you have grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I don't see him as my audience, to be honest. I sort of specialize in talking to people with good intentions that I think really want to do something. I'm not talking to the CEO of Exxon. I'm not talking to Mitch McConnell. I don't think they want to talk to me either. So it's actually, it's very convenient. They're not exactly knocking down my door. I know I'm skirting the question, but I literally have no interest in convincing him. I don't think that that's where we make change, again, is to convince, one person after another, even if it's someone as powerful as that. I mean, if he knows everything he needs to know about climate change, and this is how he acts, so you know where his priorities are, right? I mean, I'm happy for you to say something different, actually. Or Patty.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was particularly. I would say I have a capability of also doing a pretty bad comical Joe Biden imitation. If somebody wanted me to do that, I could still.
I would
do
talk
that.
to Joe Biden.
I thought you
We
would.
don't agree on everything, but
it
I
is
would be
just
interested in
interesting
talking to Joe Biden.
Because I didn't mind giving that a try, of taking off all the colorful stuff and just and stomping out, which I rarely do never do in life. So I like doing that, but I guess I still think setting the American West style, for heaven's sake, we used to try it all the time. We used to try to ever since 2016, much harder, much harder. But I guess I would do this. I would talk with Mitch McConnell one-on-one. He won't talk with me now because I've made fun of him in public, so that's not going to happen. But I would talk to him in private, just I guess so that I would know what possessed him, and I would have excellent quotations I could read from a book. But I wouldn't forfeit the chance. If I don't think there would be any point in speaking in public where he was going to have to say. I mean, I guess I don't know what it would be like to know that you could lose everything you had built your career on if you spoke honestly. But for the Republicans, when you try to think, what has become of those folks?
But that's it. That's what the most important thing is to them, is to getting reelected.
Right.
I can't talk to someone who that's his priority on earth, is to get reelected over, addressing this problem that's going to make his grandchildren's future uninhabitable.
I'd just like to add a short footnote on what you've been talking about and the great question that David brought up. And that is, I saw most of the congressional committee hearing that involved the head of Exxon, the head of Chevron, the head of BP, the vice president of API, where they had to answer some very difficult questions on TV to any of the American public who bothered to watch it, about why they were paying companies to spread lies about there wasn't any climate change, there wasn't any global warming going on. And to me, that's a glimmer of hope. It's a small step forward. They tried very hard to say, well, we're doing this, we're doing much more renewables, we're doing this, that, and the other. But of course, what they're doing doesn't forgive all the terrible things they've done in the past. Plus, it didn't really sound like that much that they're doing with all the wealth and power that they have. But nevertheless, I think more and more of that, which 20 years ago we never would have seen, says that we're making some kind of progress.
I just have to come in for a moment, though, and say I sit here thinking, love thy neighbor as thyself, treat those who despise you with. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament and there are plenty of things in the Old Testament about equity and fairness, and so I don't know what, I think it's a principle doesn't add up to much until it is really tested. And to try to be a person who believes that the better angels of someone's nature should, there are many things in the New Testament that say keep trying.
Yeah. But again, it's an approach about changing people's minds heart by heart and mind by mind. And I sort of feel like I'm interested in systemic change, which I think changes lots of hearts and lots of minds, more than, talking to individual people who are completely not on board. And and I think the way to do that is to go against everything that Mitch McConnell is doing, not to try to convince him to do something differently. But the person who asked the question,
please,
did you have something to say about
several
that?
hands. I think there's,
Or
there's
if anybody else wants to weigh in.
I've been, I try to connect issues that seem to not be connected when I talk to people. And when you talked about learned helplessness, it immediately got me thinking about the fact that, when kids are dealing in earthquake country and they're all afraid of earthquakes, one of the things that they found is really helpful is to teach them to start yelling and stamping their feet whenever an earthquake occurs. Not that it does anything, but it breaks that learned helplessness, and they stop being afraid. And I wanted to say that learned helplessness is something that societies have created for 8,000 years of patriarchy. We have raised children to have learned helplessness by not responding to their needs, and teaching mothers not to pick up children, not when they cry, not to breastfeed them for long, not to sleep with them. This is all part of a very concerted effort to keep people under control. And so when I'm talking to new mothers, or I'm talking to a pregnant woman, I try and get her to understand that the personal decisions she makes about whether to breastfeed, whether she's going to circumcise that little baby boy, whether she's going to pick him up when he cries, whether she's going to have a midwife at home or go to a hospital, is directly related to whether people in another country feel that they have the ability to make change. Because they watch America. They watch this woman bottle feeding, and then they bottle feed thinking they want to be like us, and that's the way to do it. So that's my approach, is I take it where I am and try and connect people to the realization that we have been trained out of our natural response, which is to take action. And when people are raised with their needs being met, they don't have learned helplessness. Now, that wasn't true for me. My needs weren't met. My brother's needs weren't met. Most of the kids in my generation weren't. But we grew up in the 60s. We dropped acid. We did a lot of things that just broke through the veil. So I love hearing about humor. I love hearing whatever it is that you're saying. And the fact that we're here tonight means that the conversation is in a different place than it was 10 years ago. And I'm waiting for enough pennies to drop down in the well that suddenly there's a major shift. And we don't know whether it'll be because of something one of you said tonight or something that happened when I went home and talked to my husband about this. So I'm really glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you. And in fact, there is a line in Rabbi Sachs' book about we don't know whether an action we take will have a major impact or whether, we don't know that, and we should do that. And if it's okay, I would like to ask David really quickly what David would have answered with his own question, because David has been in Congress and the rest of us have not. And so if I could just quickly, I know he wouldn't have done a cheap imitation of Mitch McConnell. Well, I know that.
Yeah, I should have posed the question differently. So I withdraw the earlier question and really put it this way, because if I'm hearing you accurately, and I think I am, we've got a huge problem with those that are either ignorant of or even with a modicum of information nonetheless become climate deniers. So if we don't attack that problem, the changes in public policy that I think are essential to dealing with this issue in the long term are still going to be elusive.
Yeah.
So, Mitch McConnell was an unfair icon of the deniers. There is the middle group out there that is going to make the difference in our politics. So that's what we need to speak to.
Yeah. And again, I think I'd go back to everyday practice and say that, I'm always saying, zoom out. What's the bigger picture, right? What actually is driving climate denial? What is actually driving climate denial? And I think that has to do with a much bigger set of basically climate. There's a rabid anti-environmentalism in this country, and climate is sort of, which like environmentalism is the curse word, and climate's the F word, right? Because climate's sort of the big thing that everybody talks about. And what drives that anti-environmentalism? I think it's very complicated, but again, it has a lot to do with, I think it has a lot to do with, I won't make the connections exactly because it would take too long, but with the public policies in this country that have most Americans really struggling to get by and who are looking for, you know, who basically have this critique of, you know, the kind of elite environmentalists who don't care about the economy and that sort of thing. So, you know, I have this analysis in my book about how I think environmentalists have talked about, have responded to that claim in ways that have just fed that hatred, that really rabid hatred. So I think, again, you know, I would say, okay, but what's driving climate denial? It's not just that people refuse to believe it. It's embedded in a much larger social and economic rifts, I think. And so, again, I think that for me, the solution is not to try to get people to, you know, I mean, of course, you can, you know, Al Gore's movie was great, but sort of, but it's more to try to deal with the broader causes of those social and economic rifts and of those resentments, those broader resentments, which I think take the form of climate denial. That's what I would say. And again, I don't think Mitch McConnell's going to be part of that transformation. So,
Agree.
you know.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, and then we ought to break and go to the reception downstairs. So here's one question.
Thank you. It's actually 2 somewhat unrelated questions, but maybe you can pick which one you would like to respond to. The first one is just kind of related to this point about where you're directing energy when you're trying to create change, and you know, whether you're trying to do it at a more systemic level or at that more individual level. I think there are some folks that are just not going to be reached, and if you have an hour to spend trying to reach them versus acting in some other way that can, you know, potentially reach 50 people or 100 people, in my mind, is a better way to spend time. So I just appreciate that statement. But one of the things that I'm, you know, wondering about in the context of this Mitch McConnell question is the degree to which we can be effective climate champions by getting out there and really getting involved in who we're electing to office in the first place. Because if we don't have Mitch McConnells in office, we're in a better place, right? Because they are presumably making some better decisions. If we are electing people who are not going to be beholden to big oil, to corporate interests, to the Russian mob, all these other things. So I'm curious about, you know, your thoughts on kind of getting involved, more involved in our election system, which is something churches don't often do, at least in the more progressive side of Christianity, but as a way of really creating bigger scale change.
Yeah.
And then my second question, that's unrelated,
Better write that down.
is as you get into this work, the closer you get, the more it hurts, and the harder it gets. So I'm curious, what do you do for yourself?
Yeah, and I, as an old person, I can't quite see well enough to completely see, but I think you're a young person. Yeah, that's definitely a question from a young person. You know, my godson Jonah, who's 20, he's like, when we say, because they're so tired of hearing that this is going to be your problem. Sorry, we're out of here, this is your problem. And he's like, bring it on, you know. But I think that just to very, very briefly address your first question, yeah, I mean, I think it's a much better use of your time. Don't worry about what car you drive. Work to get people elected who are going to actually, you know, do something systemic. Or, you know, what I say is if there's one single thing I would recommend that you do over everything else, it's insist that in an economy that impoverishes most of its citizens is not normal. It's radical, it's extreme. And then an economy that would actually allow people to have the resources that they need to thrive is normal and not radical. So, and then the second question, I do what I don't know. I do. You know, again, it's hard for me as someone who's going to be out of here probably in 20 years. You know, who knows, 20, 30, 10. But I write and I do public art projects because honestly, that's what I can do. You know, I can't design anything. You know, but I can write, and so that's what I do. You know, I try to put whatever skills I've developed over the years to work. This one I tried to write for young people, actually. It's the first thing I've tried to do specifically for young people, which is a bit presumptuous for an old person, but I just wanted to do something for my nephews a little bit more directly. But Patty, you probably thought a lot about this stuff. Yeah.
Well, the generational big picture here is not, by any definition, comfortable. The baby boomers with their don't trust anyone over 30 and so on. It is remarkable how poorly the ideals of my youth worked out. And I spent a lot of time, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years kind of asking students if they wanted to express their rage at me, or me standing in for Mitch McConnell, I suppose. I guess we're about the same age, maybe he's a little bit older. So I guess my feeling is that it's very hard for me to think why there is not more of a reckoning of what is posterity going to think about us. Well, why would we do that, I suppose, if you're in that spirit of saying, well, we're going to be dead then, so it doesn't really matter if we're condemned. But courting the good opinion of those who follow us, you'd think that would be an audience people would care about. And the thing that is very confusing for me personally is that with this project of helping young historians reach wider audiences, that's how I spend a good share of my time, working with people who are dramatically younger than me, with the student veterans that I get to hang out with. I feel like this is a little bit over the top to say, but when I get to the go where you were called, go where you think I feel like I got to be in intergenerational heaven in my daily interactions. Why there is not more, but I guess what would the generational rage do if they wanted to, what would life be like if every time a baby boomer walked down the street, a 23-year-old would say, thanks a lot? I mean, would that be some...
We deserve it.
Well, of course we do. Of course we do. But would any of the problems that our generation perpetrated, or would... Yeah. So there's something about that, and I guess that's where I just get back to, I think I had a quotation that I didn't use, about wrongdoers and what is to be done about wrongdoers, and it seems like it's a really good quotation to think about that, because it'll take me just a second here to find this. This is this wise man saying that. Well, I can paraphrase. I guess I won't struggle. Oh dear. Oh, here it is. You never know. Justice in the Hebrew Bible is more than a matter of law. Justice restores a broken order. By suffering the wrong he inflicted on others, the wrongdoer comes to feel remorse. He or she repairs the damage they have done. Exile ends in homecoming, and something of the lost harmony of the world is restored. So that passage struck me when I was reading the book, because I thought if a generation burns a lot of fossil fuels, well, to some degree, I guess I just thought maybe it doesn't work, because by suffering the wrong he inflicted on others, well, that's undermined by we're going to be out of here, and they're going to have it there. But this passage that the wrongdoer who really takes on the responsibility, exile ends in homecoming. That'd be nice.
15-year-olds. If anybody has 15-year-olds, 15 to 20 right now, talk to those kids. They're gonna dig us out. They're amazing. Yeah, I think that we thought maybe it was the millennials, but I actually think it's the next generation who's really grown up with this completely. who's going to, really start to dig us out, hopefully.
Right. And I mean, I am swept away constantly
I
by
have
that
faith.
bravery and courage and enterprise. I would say maybe most conspicuously with the student veterans, many of whom served in combat, and who have a spirit that is uplifting.
I think I'm the last question. Snuck in here. So earlier you talked about the power of story. And as a scientist who often ventures off into science communication, oftentimes the good data and a good story can be undermined by the fear-provoking anecdote. The anecdote that says, the child, my child had a vaccine and got autism, even though the science says that that's not the case. And so the fear-provoking anecdote is one story. The fear-provoking lie can be a story. And there's kind of a flip side of the dark side of the power of story there. How do you manage that? And I think my personal belief is that there's a humor aspect in there too, that humor diffuses that story and compassion. But I'm curious about how do you deal with the dark story that can undermine all the good science and all the good storytelling you tell?
Can I take that, Pat? When you say to that, I think decline of the humanities. There's been an incredible decline in critical thinking. I was talking, actually, Jonah and I are doing a series called Jenny and Jonah Save the Planet, where we just do these ridiculous riffs about saving the planet. And what we did in our last one is talk about how we're in the new BC era, beyond context. Nobody talks, it's an exaggeration, but so much of the discourse that happens in this country now is without context. And to me, that's what one of the real skills that humanities teaches you. And what I'm seeing is, you could also ascribe it to social media, to, lots of things. But what I think of when you're saying that is actually the decline of the humanities, that people don't know how to interpret that bad anecdote, right? And to say, but let's put that in context, right? And so much of what you see, just turn on CNN, is just like, there's no context, right? It's just sound bites. There's no context, whether it's CNN or Fox News. And so I think a lot of that has to do with the decline of the humanities, which I think is very, very convenient. I actually see the fetishization of STEM, which really starts right around in the Reagan era, as very, very convenient, for a particular kind of politics. So, I would just flip that on its head a little bit and say, I think for me, the problem is not so much that people are using those anecdotes, but that we have, a citizenry basically that's had education, that our educational system doesn't teach people how to interpret those, how to read, write, and think, basically, which I think is the job of the humanities and other fields. But.
Right. Not to blame the victim there, but humanities has not really risen to this. The academic prose and the inwardness looking of the humanities, no. But Socrates was an interesting fellow, and he kept asking people questions. So if you told Socrates an anecdote, he'd say, explain that to me more. Tell me more about it. So I think there is something that very time-consuming, and again, the one person at a time, good Lord, but there's something about how to hear someone. This is such a cliche of our time, and the people who say it don't seem to be very good at it. We must listen to other people. Well, what if they are driving us mad with what they're saying? Are we to listen to other people at that stage? Yes, probably yes. And I have, and what you're to do then is to say, you could say, where did you learn that? And why did you trust that? I mean, you can ask questions and work on that, but the contempt and outrage thing seems to just add to the flames of opposition on that. So I don't know. Life seems shorter to me than it used to, and spending my time listening to people tell me nonsensical things and saying patiently and kindly, could you tell me more about how,
Doesn't seem like
70 years old, I'm going to do that, for heaven's sake. But I do think there's something to be done with the listen and ask questions.
Yep.
And I don't know what else there is to be done. To say, you have that wrong, and I shall show you several PowerPoint slides that will establish that. I mean, it's just, well, that's not going to do it. So, and I guess this is where I feel endlessly lucky, because I grew up in a small town where I thought I was bored, and so I will do anything to be amused. I will do anything. And so if this and that, asking somebody, where'd you get that? I can see that I would have funny, but I don't want to tell funny stories about it. Mocking them is not going to be the goal there. So anyway, I think there is something about taking it in, pondering it, and thinking, what would a series of attentive questions make possible?
I like that.
Okay.
Patty,
We'll end with
you
a
reminded
note of
me
tolerance and hope.
of a quote, of a quote that I have up in my office that says, the surest way of making an enemy of your friend is to tell him he's wrong. First, I'd like to remind you that there are some books available. If you're interested in purchasing one, they're outside there. There's also, Tom's holding them up in the back. These lectureships are possible partly through donations. If any of you feel inclined, we would appreciate that. And there's going to be a reception downstairs for those of you still awake and can manage it. And I'd like to thank these two characters very much for the excellent dialogue that we just listened to.